The auctioneer's gavel came down hard. $12. And just like that, I owned a hole in the ground in the middle of Montana. I was 18 years old. I had $87 left in my pocket, a rusted pickup truck that used to belong to my father, and nowhere else to go. The men standing around me at that county surplus auction laughed. One of them, a thick-necked farmer with mud caked on his boots, shook his head and muttered something to the man beside him. I heard it clearly over the noise of the crowd. Girl bought herself a hole. I pretended I didn't hear. I walked up to the clerk's table and signed my name on the deed. My hand was steady, my heart was not. The paper felt thin between my fingers, almost weightless, like it might dissolve if I held it too long. But it was mine. For the first time in my life, something was legally, officially, entirely mine. My name is Mara Wynn. 3 days before I bought that hole in the ground, I had been living in a house with a mother who wouldn't look at me and a stepfather who looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't budgeted for. Let me tell you about that morning. The morning everything ended and everything began. It was June. Hot already at 7 in the morning, the kind of heat that sits on your chest before you've even had coffee. The kitchen smelled like burnt eggs and old coffee grounds. My mother, Linda, stood at the stove with her back to me, stirring something she wasn't going to eat. She never ate breakfast anymore. She made it for Roy. Roy Tanner. That was my stepfather's name. He had married my mother 14 months earlier in a courthouse ceremony I wasn't invited to. I found out about it when I came home from school and saw his boots by the front door. His jacket hanging on the hook where my father's jacket used to hang. My father had been dead for 5 years by then. Car accident on an icy road outside of Billings. They told us he didn't suffer, which is what people say when they don't know what else to tell you. Roy sat at the kitchen table that morning reading the newspaper. He didn't look up when I walked in. He never looked up when I walked in. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the counter waiting. Not for anything specific, just for some sign that I existed inside these walls that used to be mine. My mother turned from the stove. Her eyes met mine for half a second, then slid away like I was too bright to look at directly. Roy folded his newspaper with a slow, deliberate motion. Set it on the table. Then he looked at me. Really looked for the first time that morning. His eyes were flat and colorless, the eyes of a man calculating, not feeling. "You're 18 now," he said. His voice was calm, almost reasonable. I waited. "You'll figure it out." That was it. No raised voice, no cruelty in the dramatic sense, just 5 words delivered like a weather report. Matter of fact. Final. I looked at my mother. I waited for her to say something, to argue, to tell him that this was my home, that I had grown up in these rooms, that my father had carried me on his shoulders through that front door when I was 3 years old, that the walls of my bedroom were painted the exact shade of blue I had chosen myself. Standing in the paint aisle at the hardware store, with my father's hand warm around mine. She didn't say anything. She just kept stirring. The eggs had been burning for 2 minutes. She kept stirring anyway. That silence. That was the thing that broke something in me. Not Roy's words, not his flat eyes or his folded newspaper or his boots on the hook. It was my mother's silence. The deliberate practiced stillness of a woman who had decided that keeping her new life intact was worth more than the daughter standing 4 feet away from her. I stood there for another 10 seconds. I counted them. Then I went to pack. I packed in under an hour. 1 backpack, 2 duffel bags. Everything I owned in the world fit into a space smaller than the bed of Roy's truck. I had the $87 in my checking account, money saved from babysitting jobs and weekend shifts at the diner on Route 9. I had my father's truck, a 1974 Ford F-100, with a cracked windshield and an engine that knocked in cold weather like someone politely requesting entry. I had no job lined up, no apartment, no plan, no person waiting for me anywhere on earth. My mother stood in the doorway of my bedroom while I packed. She didn't help. She didn't offer to help. She stood with her arms crossed over her chest, watching me fold my clothes into tight, efficient squares the way my grandmother had taught me. The room looked different, with my things being removed from it, smaller. The walls were that same pale blue they'd been since I was 8 years old. I remembered standing on a stepladder, watching my father work the roller, asking him if he was sure about the color. Blue like the sky I had told him, so I can fly even when I'm inside. He had laughed and painted the whole room that afternoon without stopping once. Now the blue looked faded, tired, like it had been trying to hold something together for years and had finally run out of strength. "Mara," my mother said. I didn't answer. "Mara, please." I zipped the second duffel bag and straightened up, looked at her, really looked for the first time in months. She was 42 years old, but she looked older, tired in a way that sleep couldn't touch. The kind of tired that comes from swallowing things down for so long that there's no room left for anything new. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He just needs things to be uncomplicated. And I'm complicated." It wasn't a question. Her eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. That was the thing about my mother. She had learned somewhere along the road to keep everything inside, to compress her feelings until they took up no space at all. I used to think it was strength. Standing there in that faded blue room, I understood for the first time that it wasn't strength at all. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I picked up my bags. "No," I said. "You're not." I walked out the front door of the house where I had learned to read, where I had measured my height against the kitchen door frame every birthday until I turned 13, where my father had once chased me through the backyard with a garden hose on a July afternoon while I screamed with laughter. I did not look back. If I had looked back, I might have seen her standing at the window. I might have seen her hand pressed flat against the glass. I might have seen the tears she wouldn't let me watch fall. But I didn't look back, and so I never knew for certain. And not knowing became its own kind of weight I would carry for a long time. The first night I slept in my truck in the parking lot of a Walmart 12 miles outside of town. I parked in the far corner away from the lights, reclined the seat as far as it would go, pulled a blanket over my shoulders and told myself this was temporary, that tomorrow I would find a job, that next week I would have an apartment, that next month everything would look different. The lies we tell ourselves are the kindest lies of all. I woke at 3 in the morning to the sound of a shopping cart rattling across the asphalt. An old man was pushing it slowly, his cart filled with aluminum cans. His body bent forward at an angle that looked permanent. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. People who live on the margins learn not to see each other. It's easier. I watched him disappear into the shadow at the edge of the lot, and I thought about what it meant to become invisible. Not the dramatic kind of invisible, not the kind in stories. The ordinary, quiet kind. The kind where you are simply no longer accounted for in anyone's plans. The second night, a security guard knocked on my window at 2 in the morning. His flashlight cut through the glass and swept across the pile of clothes I was using as a pillow. He was not unkind. He told me there was a shelter downtown if I needed it. He told me I couldn't stay. I didn't go to the shelter. I'd heard things about shelters. Instead, I found a spot behind an abandoned church on the eastern edge of town. A brick building with boarded windows and a steeple that leaned slightly to the left, like a man listening hard to something in the distance. The parking lot was cracked and full of weeds pushing up through the asphalt. Nobody came there. Nobody saw me. I pulled the blanket over my head and listened to the crickets in the grass and told myself again that this was temporary. The third night it rained. I discovered a leak in the roof of the truck I hadn't known about. Water dripped onto my face in a slow, cold, steady rhythm like a clock marking time. I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, watching rain trace lines down the windshield. And I thought about my father. I thought about the way he used to sing in the shower off-key and completely without shame. I thought about the last morning I saw him, how he had been running late, rushing out with his coffee in one hand and his keys in the other, and how he had kissed me on the top of the head and said, "See you tonight, ladybug." There was no tonight. There was only an icy road and a phone call that arrived at dinner time and changed the entire shape of the world. I didn't cry that night in the leaking truck. I wanted to, but something inside me had gone still and hard, like a pond freezing over, and the tears were there somewhere underneath the ice, but I couldn't reach them. I wasn't sure if that was a good thing or a dangerous thing. I decided it didn't matter. What mattered was getting through the night. What mattered was figuring out what came next. The next morning, I drove to a gas station, washed my face in the bathroom sink, and made myself look at my reflection. Dark circles. Hair that needed washing. The expression of someone who had been running on adrenaline long enough that the adrenaline was starting to run out. "You look like hell," I told the girl in the mirror. She didn't argue. I walked out into the early heat and started down Main Street without a specific destination. Moving felt better than standing still. Standing still felt too much like surrender. That's when I saw the flyer. It was taped to the window of the feed supply store on the corner, slightly crooked, the bottom edge curling from humidity. County surplus auction. Saturday, 9 a.m. Unclaimed agricultural structures. Clearwater County Fairgrounds. I didn't know what unclaimed agricultural structures meant. I wasn't sure I cared. But I knew what auctions meant. Auctions meant cheap. And cheap was the only thing I could afford. Saturday was 2 days away. I had nothing else to do, and nowhere else to be. I showed up at 9. The Clearwater County Fairgrounds smelled like diesel and dry hay, and the particular dusty emptiness of a place that only comes alive a few times a year. The crowd was mostly men, farmers with thick forearms and permanent squints from years of watching weather. Two younger guys who looked like they bought scrap metal for a living, their truck beds already loaded with salvaged equipment from earlier lots. An older woman in a floral dress who seemed to be there for the entertainment rather than the commerce. A handful of others. I stood at the back and tried to look like I belonged. The auctioneer was a thin man with a voice like gravel being poured into a metal bucket. He moved through the lots quickly, his words running together in that practiced cadence that auctioneers develop over years of repetition. A rusted hay baler went for $15, broken fencing panels for $8, old water troughs with holes in the bottom $3 each. Everything sold fast. Everything sold cheap. The farmers and the scrap men got what they came for without much competition. Near the end, the auctioneer shuffled his papers and cleared his throat. Item 17, he announced. Collapsed root cellar. Parcel 14C. Minimum bid $9. A few people chuckled. Someone to my left made a comment under his breath. I turned and saw him for the first time. Harlan Gideon. He was 63 years old with a face like weathered leather and eyes that had looked at the horizon for so many decades. That disappointment had become their resting expression. He wore denim overalls that had been patched in at least 6 different places, and his hands were thick and calloused in the way of someone who had spent a lifetime working ground that didn't always cooperate. He stood with his weight slightly back arms crossed, the posture of a man who had seen enough auctions to know when something was worth his attention and when it wasn't. He was not paying attention. "That's the sinkhole behind the old Harris place," he said to the man next to him, just loud enough for me to hear. "Been that way since before my daddy was born." The auctioneer nodded. Technically classified as a failed agricultural storage structure. Stone construction circa 1892. In need of significant restoration. More laughter. The scrap metal men shook their heads. The farmers exchanged the kind of glances that pass between people who share a private language built from years of working the same soil. Nobody raised a hand. The auctioneer looked around the crowd with the patience of a man who had sold stranger things. $9. The minimum. Sitting there, unclaimed. I don't know exactly what made me do it. I've thought about that moment many times since standing in that fairground in the June heat with $87 to my name, and I've never been able to explain it cleanly. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the simple, stubborn arithmetic of needing something to be mine and having almost nothing to spend. Maybe it was the word that had snagged in my mind from the flyer. Structure. Even a failed one. Even a collapsed one. A structure was still something. A structure was more than a Walmart parking lot. $12, I said. My voice came out clear, steady, younger than I felt. Every head turned. Harlan Gideon looked at me the way you look at something unexpected, not rude, not cruel, just surprised in the particular way of someone who has stopped anticipating surprises. The auctioneer blinked once. "Do I hear $12? He looked around the crowd for a counterbid. None came. Nobody wanted a collapsed root cellar behind the old Harris place. Nobody except the 18-year-old girl at the back with dirt on her boots and a cracked windshield on her truck. The gavel came down. Sold. $12 to the young lady in the back. I heard Harlan Gideon mutter something to the man beside him. I didn't catch all of it, but I caught enough. Girl bought herself a hole. I walked up to the clerk's table and signed my name. Mara Wynn. The deed was printed on thin paper county seal in the corner. The property described in the dry, precise language of legal documents that reveals nothing of what a place actually is or means. I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket. On the drive out to the property, I kept one hand on the wheel and one hand pressed against my jacket, feeling the outline of the folded deed through the fabric. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself this was just the beginning of a plan. I did not let myself think too hard about what the plan actually was, because thinking too hard about it might have made it fall apart before I even got there. The land sat half a mile off a gravel road past a sagging fence line that had given up trying to be a fence and had become more of a suggestion. The truck bounced over ruts and rocks, the engine knocking its familiar greeting. The June sky was enormous above the grass, that specific Montana blue that looks like it goes up forever. And the air coming through the cracked window smelled like dry grass and something green underneath it. Something alive and faintly sweet. I rolled the window all the way down and let the wind tangle my hair. For a moment, just one moment, I felt something that might have been hope. Then I saw the property. Or rather, I saw almost nothing. A field of dry grass with a shallow depression in the center. A sinking of the earth where the soil had pulled inward like a held breath. The grass grew unevenly across the surface, thicker in some spots, thin and yellowing in others, as if the ground beneath couldn't quite decide what it wanted to do. I parked the truck, got out, and walked to the edge of the depression. It was maybe 20 feet across. In the center, the old hatch doors that had once sealed the entrance had long since rotted away, leaving a dark opening in the earth. Around the opening, I could see the tops of stones. Old stones. Stacked with intention. I stood at the edge for a long moment. Then I climbed down. The slope was steep and the soil was loose near the top, crumbling under my boots as I worked my way down to the opening. I had to push aside some fallen timber to get through wood so far gone with rot that it came apart in my hands like wet paper. Inside, the air changed immediately. Cooler. Darker. Still, I straightened up. The walls were stone. Old fieldstone hand-laid, stacked with a precision that suggested someone who had known exactly what they were doing. The mortar between the stones was lime-based, cracked in places, missing in others. But the stones themselves had barely moved. They were fitted tightly the way an experienced hand fits things together with patience and an understanding of weight and pressure, and how long things need to last. The chamber was deeper than the outside suggested, nearly 8 feet at the lowest point. The original footprint was roughly 12 by 14, with the beginning of a barrel-vaulted ceiling design that had once been framed in wood. The wood framing had failed. The wood was gone. But the stone walls that had been meant to support it were still standing, 18 inches thick at minimum. I walked the perimeter slowly. I pressed my palm flat against the stone at chest height. Cold. Dense. patient. This wall had been standing since 1892. It had outlasted the Harris family and everyone who came after them, and the wooden roof that had protected it, and the county's memory of what it was. It was still here. I looked up at the open sky through the collapsed roof. Blue rectangle. Montana blue. I looked back at the walls. Everyone else who had stood in that auction today had seen a failed structure, a liability, something to laugh at. I saw 8 feet of usable vertical space. I saw stone walls thick enough to hold any load I could build above them. I saw a floor that could be leveled, a ceiling that could be rebuilt, a chamber that was already insulated by 10 feet of earth on 3 sides, and would hold heat in winter and cool in summer, without a single dollar spent on mechanical systems. I saw square footage. I saw potential. I saw something that with enough work and enough stubbornness could become the one thing I needed most in the world. I saw home. I stood in that underground chamber for a long time, long enough for the light to shift above me, the blue rectangle moving slowly as the afternoon progressed. I was not a builder. I had never built anything larger than a birdhouse, a project from 7th grade that had come out lopsided and had made my father laugh with a kind of delighted pride that had nothing to do with the quality of the birdhouse. But I had read. In the long, quiet afternoons when my mother was at work, and I didn't want to be in the house alone with Roy, I had walked to the public library on Elm Street and disappeared into the stacks for hours at a time. History, science, engineering, architecture, the mechanics of how things were assembled, and why they held and why they fell. I remembered something now, standing in that cool underground space. Something from a book about traditional building methods that I had read on a rainy Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago. Underground structures don't fight the environment. They cooperate with it. The earth absorbs temperature, extremes holds warmth in winter, maintains cool in summer. The key isn't the soil. It's the structure within the soil. That night I sat in the front seat of my truck with a notebook balanced on my knee and a pen that was running low on ink, and I sketched. The dome light was dim and the mosquitoes were finding the gap in the window, but I kept drawing. Main living chamber built within the original stone footprint. Secondary storage and utility space dug laterally into the hillside to the east, where the slope provided natural opportunity. A rear sleeping area smaller, quieter further back into the earth. A drainage system around the entire perimeter to prevent water infiltration. Ventilation shafts, 2 of them positioned for natural convection. A small wood stove with a chimney pipe angled through reinforced sleeve in the rebuilt roof. I looked at what I had drawn for a long time. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a shelter in the emergency sense. It was a house, small underground, built by a girl with $87 and a second-hand shovel, and no formal training in anything. But a house. The next morning I drove to Bert's salvage on the south edge of town. Bert was a gruff man in his 60s with a gray beard and the permanent expression of someone who expected to be disappointed but wasn't always. I asked if I could borrow a wheelbarrow. He looked at me for a long moment. "What for?" I told him. He looked at me for another long moment. Then he walked to the back of the yard and came out wheeling a barrow that had seen better years but was structurally sound. "Don't break it," he said. I won't. You probably will. That's fine. Just bring back the pieces. I started with the debris. The fallen timber came out first. Piece by piece hauled up the slope and piled to one side. The wood was waterlogged and half-rotted and heavier than its size suggested. And by the end of the first hour, my arms were shaking and my back was making new complaints. I kept going. Every piece that came out was a piece that wasn't pressing down on the stone walls. Every wheelbarrow of soil that I hauled to the surface was one less load the structure was carrying. The first day I worked 12 hours. The second day the same. By the end of the first week, I had cleared enough debris to stand freely in the original chamber and see the walls clearly from floor to the remnants of the ceiling line. The foundation was sound. The walls were sound. What I had drawn in that notebook by the light of the dome light was not a fantasy. It was a plan. And the plan was real. I was hauling a wheelbarrow up the slope at the end of the second week when I heard a truck on the gravel road. I set the barrow down and waited, wiping my hands on my jeans. Harlan, Gideon parked and walked toward me slowly the way you approach something uncertain. He stopped at the edge of the depression and looked down. Then he looked at me. His expression had the same quality it had carried at the auction, a man observing something that didn't fit his existing categories. You burying something, he said. Building something, I said. He stared at the hole. He stared at me. Something moved through his expression. Something I couldn't read. Something that looked like it cost him something to feel. Then he shook his head and turned back toward his truck. Going to end up burying yourself, he said over his shoulder. That thing's going to collapse and they'll find you come spring. He drove away. I picked up the handles of the wheelbarrow and went back to work. On a Thursday in the third week, I drove into town to buy concrete. I had saved $40 from 2 days of work I'd picked up clearing brush at a ranch 7 miles east, and I needed it to stretch as far as it could. I stood at the counter of Clearwater Building Supply, calculating out loud, moving bags off the shelf and back again, trying to make the math work. I was still 4 bags short of what I actually needed when I heard a voice behind me. You're building something. I turned. He was maybe 19, wearing a store apron with chalky handprints on the front and sawdust in his hair. His name tag read Bridger. His eyes were curious the way certain people's eyes are the kind of curiosity that isn't intrusive, just present. He was looking at the concrete bags on the counter and at the money in my hand and at my face, reading the situation with the quiet competence of someone who worked with materials every day and understood what shortfalls looked like. Yes, I said. What kind of something, I told him. Not everything but enough, but the hatch, the stone walls, the plan I'd drawn in the notebook. He listened without interrupting. We've got bags in back that got wet along one corner, he said when I finished. Can't sell them full price. I can let them go for $1.50 less per bag if you want. I looked at him. Why? He shrugged. Because they're going to sit in back until they set solid, and then we throw them out. This way, at least they get used. It was a practical answer. Maybe the most purely practical answer anyone had given me in months. I took the bags. Bridger came out to the property for the first time that Saturday. He brought a truckload of scrap lumber cut-offs from custom orders that were headed for the burn pile. He said he had a few hours free. He didn't ask permission exactly. He just showed up with the lumber and unloaded it and waited to see what I said. I didn't say much, but I used every piece. That was how it started between us. Not romantically, not the way it happens in stories. Just practically quietly with the particular respect that grows between people who are both good at working and have decided to work toward the same end. He came when he could. He helped where I let him. He didn't push. He didn't overstep. He seemed to understand, without being told that this was my project, my land, my plan. His help was an addition, not a takeover. Ruth Gideon came on a Thursday evening in late July, 3 weeks into the build. I was underground when I heard a voice above an older woman's voice calling down into the dark. I climbed up into the late sun and found her standing at the edge of the depression, small, silver-haired, a covered casserole dish in both hands. She looked at me without flinching at the dirt and sweat, without stepping back from the dark hole in the ground. "You're the girl who bought the Harris cellar," she said. "Yes, ma'am." She held out the casserole dish. "I brought you supper. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in some time." I hesitated. In my experience up to that point, kindness from strangers had a cost. Everything had a cost. But she was 61 years old, and she was holding a casserole dish with both hands, and the food smelled like something warm and real. And I hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days. "Thank you," I said. She nodded once. "Don't mention it to my husband. Harlan has strong opinions about things he doesn't understand. Your husband is the man who told me I'd be found in the spring." "Yes," she said. A small pause. "He's not a bad man. Just stubborn and frightened, though he'd never use that word for himself." She looked past me into the dark opening of the hatch. "She would have liked you," she said quietly. "Who?" She looked back at me with an expression that held an entire landscape of grief behind it. "My daughter." She let a breath go. "She passed young. She was full of plans." She didn't explain further. She handed me the casserole dish and walked back to her car, moving with the careful deliberateness of someone whose heart had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. I stood at the edge of the property and watched her go. I ate the whole casserole that night, sitting on the tailgate of my truck. It was the best thing I had tasted in weeks, maybe longer. 3 days later, on a Tuesday afternoon, a silver car I did not recognize pulled up on the gravel beside my truck. The woman who got out was maybe 45. She wore clothes that cost more than everything I own combined. Her hair was done in the way that requires a certain kind of professional and a certain kind of budget. Her nails were painted a deep red that looked in the afternoon light like dried blood. She surveyed the property the way you survey something you're already calculating a price for. She looked at me like I was a minor inconvenience standing between her and the thing she wanted. "You must be the girl who bought this parcel," she said. "I'm the owner," I said. She smiled. It was a practice smile, the kind assembled from the outside, rather than arising from the inside. "My name is Diane Keller. I'm a real estate investor out of Billings. I heard about the auction." She reached into her jacket. "I'd like to make you an offer. $500, cash, today." I looked at the envelope she was extending. The property isn't for sale. The smile didn't change. Everything's for sale at the right price. You're young, clearly resourceful, but this land has complications you probably don't know about yet. Legal issues, zoning problems. I'm offering you a clean exit before things get complicated. I looked at her, at the silver car, at the confident stillness of a woman who had offered people clean exits before and had always gotten what she came for. The property isn't for sale, I said again. The smile flickered, just for a moment. Something cold moved underneath it. Something that was there, and then wasn't covered again by the smooth surface of professional composure. You'll regret that decision, she said. She got back in her car. The engine started without a sound. She pulled out onto the gravel road and drove away with unhurried precision, the way people drive when they know they'll be back. I stood in the afternoon heat and watched the dust settle behind her car. The cold feeling stayed with me long after the dust was gone. I didn't know yet who Diane Keller really was. I didn't know what she wanted badly enough to drive out from Billings on a Tuesday afternoon to offer cash to an 18-year-old girl with a shovel. I didn't know about the mineral surveys or the rare earth deposits or the 6 other properties she had already taken by similar means. I only knew one thing with certainty as I walked back to the hatch and climbed down into the cool of the stone chamber. I was slowly bringing back to life. She would be back, and when she came back, I intended to be ready. The week after Diane Keller drove away, I went to the library. Not because I had a plan yet, because I needed to understand what I was dealing with before I could build one, and because the library was the one place I'd always gone when the world felt larger than I knew how to navigate. Books had been my architecture long before I ever touched a stone wall. The structure of knowledge assembled over years, free to anyone willing to climb into the stacks and look. Mrs. Austin was at the reference desk when I walked in, a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the particular stillness of someone who had spent decades surrounded by quiet and had grown to resemble it. She looked up when I came through the door, registered me the way librarians register regulars with a small nod that meant she had noted my existence and filed it appropriately. I found a table in the back corner and spread out what I had. The deed to parcel 14C, the county tax statement, a notebook, a pen. I started with zoning law. I read for 4 hours without stopping. Montana Property Code, agricultural land classifications, building permit requirements for structures in unincorporated rural areas. The language was dense and circular in the way that legal documents always are written to include everything and clarify nothing, but I moved through it slowly and carefully, the way I had learned to move through difficult material, reading each sentence twice before moving on, taking notes in the margins of my notebook, building a map of what I knew and what I still needed to find out. At some point, Mrs. Austin appeared at the end of my table with a cup of coffee in a paper cup from the machine in the hallway. She set it down without being asked. "You're researching something specific," she said. It wasn't a question. Property law, agricultural exemptions, historic preservation codes. She looked at my notebook. She looked at me. Something in her expression changed in a way I couldn't quite read. She pulled out the chair across from me and sat down, which was not something I had expected. "This wouldn't have anything to do with the Keller woman," she said. I looked up sharply. "You know her. Everyone in this county knows Diane Keller, or knows of her." Mrs. Austin folded her hands on the table with the deliberateness of someone choosing words carefully. 3 years ago, she approached the Aldous family, Frank and Marlene Aldous. They'd been farming the same land southeast of here for 4 generations. She told them the property was worth almost nothing. Soil problems, drainage issues. She had paperwork to support it. Appraisals, environmental assessments. She paused. "They sold," I said. "They sold." Frank told me afterward he'd felt relieved, like he was finally free of something that had been draining them for years. She looked at me steadily. 6 months later, Diane Keller sold that same land to a mining company out of Denver for 11 times what she'd paid for it. The coffee was going cold in the paper cup. I didn't touch it. "Mineral rights," I said. Mrs. Austin nodded. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and produced a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table between us and smoothed it flat. It was a photocopy, a geological survey abstract, the kind of dense technical document that most people would look at for 2 seconds and set aside. "This whole region," she said, tapping the map at the center of the page, "sits on a deposit of rare earth minerals. Has for 100 million years. The big extraction companies have known about it for decades. They've been buying land quietly through intermediaries for the past 10 years. She looked at me. "People like Diane Keller." I looked at the map, at the shaded area indicating the mineral deposit, at parcel 14C sitting squarely within it. $12. I had paid $12 for land that was sitting on top of something worth, by the numbers implied in that geological abstract, somewhere in the range of $2 million in extractable rare earth minerals. Diane Keller had offered me $500. I sat with that for a moment, the full weight of it, the specific coldness of understanding how thoroughly she had intended to take me. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Mrs. Austin picked up the photocopy and tucked it back into her cardigan pocket. "Because Frank Aldous is a good man who got cheated out of his family's legacy because nobody told him what his land was actually worth." She looked at me with the measured directness of someone who had made a decision and was committed to it. I'd rather not watch it happen again. She stood, smoothed her cardigan, and went back to her desk. I sat at that table for another 2 hours. Then I found what I was looking for. Montana Historic Preservation Act, Section 47, Subsection 2, Paragraph 1. The language was dry and precise, the way important things often are. Structures constructed prior to 1900 on designated agricultural land that demonstrate evidence of original construction and current restoration intent may qualify for expedited heritage classification, granting permanent protection from development modification or mineral extraction activities that would compromise structural integrity. I read it 3 times. Permanent protection from mineral extraction. I'd been thinking about this backwards. I'd been thinking about how to defend the land, how to fight a zoning challenge, how to push back against whatever legal pressure Diane Keller was preparing to bring. But the answer wasn't defense. The answer was designation. If the Cellar qualified for heritage classification under the Historic Preservation Act, The land beneath it became untouchable. Not just hard to take, untouchable. But I needed proof. The law required evidence of original construction, documentation that the structure had existed before 1900, and I needed evidence of restoration intent, which I'd been accumulating every day without realizing it. Every photograph I'd taken with the $3 yard sale camera, every dated entry in my notebook, describing what I'd done and why, every material receipt with a timestamp. The original construction was the problem. I needed documentation from 1892. I knew where documentation like that would be. If it existed at all, it would be in the county records archive. Deeds, surveys, construction records, the accumulated paperwork of a county that had been formally organized since the 1880s. Boxes and boxes of it, most of it never digitized. Most of it not looked at in decades. I needed to go through every one of them. I went to see Bridger the next morning at the building supply store. He was in the back moving inventory, and when I explained what I needed and why he set down the box he was carrying and looked at me with the quiet attention he always gave to problems that had a practical solution hiding somewhere inside them. "County Records Office," he said. "Tuesday through Thursday, 9 to 4. They've got everything back to 1882 in the basement, mostly in boxes. Have you been there?" "Went once for my uncle when he was disputing a fence line." He paused. "It's a lot of boxes." "I know." He picked the box back up. "I've got Thursday off." That was all he said. That was enough. Before Thursday, Diane Keller came back. She arrived on a Wednesday afternoon without warning, the silver car moving up the gravel road with the same unhurried confidence as before. I was on the surface reinforcing the entrance frame when I heard her coming, and I set down my tools and stood up straight and waited. She got out of the car. This time she wasn't smiling. The professional composure was still there. The expensive clothes, the perfect hair. But something underneath had shifted. She walked toward me without the performance of warmth, without the extended hand and the practiced friendliness. She walked like a woman who had moved past offering and was now simply stating, "I've done some additional research on your situation," she said. "You're operating without building permits. Zoning classification on this parcel doesn't permit residential structures. What you're building down there is technically illegal." She tilted her head slightly. "I'm offering you a way out before the county gets involved." "How much this time?" I said. She didn't blink. "$750. $750. For $2 million in mineral rights." "I have lawyers in Billings," she said. "This can go a long way you don't want it to go." I looked at her, at the expensive car, at the nails that looked like dried blood in the afternoon light, at the absolute confidence of a woman who had done this before and had always, every single time, gotten what she came for. "I have the law," I said. "The actual law. The written down kind." Something moved behind her eyes. Quick. Gone. "You'll find that law is more complicated than books make it sound," she said. "I'm a fast reader." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she turned and walked back to her car and drove away down the gravel road, the tires cutting clean lines through the dust. I watched until the car was out of sight. Then I went back inside the stone chamber and sat on the concrete floor I had poured with my own hands and breathed slowly until the shaking in my legs stopped. She wasn't wrong that this could go bad. She wasn't wrong that she had lawyers and I had a notebook. She wasn't wrong that the process of fighting someone with resources from a position of having none was long and grinding and designed in ways both subtle and obvious to exhaust people who couldn't sustain a prolonged fight. What she was wrong about was thinking I couldn't sustain it. I had been sustaining things since I was 18 years old and woke up to rain dripping on my face in a leaking truck. I had been sustaining things since the morning I stood in a faded blue kitchen and watched my mother choose silence. Sustaining was at this point the thing I was best at in the world. The next day, Sheriff Wade Pruitt drove out to the property. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders and deliberate in the way he moved, the kind of deliberateness that comes not from slowness but from having learned that measured movement communicates authority more effectively than urgency. He wore his position the way certain men wear good coats, like something they'd grown into over years until it fit them correctly. He walked to the edge of the depression and looked down at what I'd built. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked. "Miss Wynne," he said, "I received a complaint." "About what?" He opened a small notebook. "Unauthorized construction, possible zoning violations, structural safety concerns." I kept my voice level. "Who filed it?" He looked at me steadily. "Does it matter?" "It matters if someone is trying to use the county to take my property." He was quiet for a moment. Then he closed the notebook. "I'm not here to take anything. I'm here to assess the situation." He nodded toward the hatch. "Can I see what you've built?" I took him down. He stood in the main chamber and turned slowly, looking at the reinforced walls. The new support beams, the concrete floor, the drainage channels I'd carved along the perimeter. He looked at the ventilation pipe I'd installed the framing for the rebuilt roof, the dated notebooks I kept on a shelf near the entrance with photographs tucked between the pages. He didn't speak for a long time. "You built all this yourself," he said. "Mostly. I had some help moving materials." "Where did you learn?" "Books, common sense, trial and error." He looked at the stone walls. He pressed one hand against the fieldstone the way I had done on the first day, feeling the solidity of it. "Are you living here?" he asked. "Yes." "Since when?" 3 weeks after I bought it." He nodded slowly, looked at the ceiling, looked at me. "Technically, you need permits for this kind of construction. The county has codes." "I know. I've been reading them." "Then you know you're in violation." "I know I might be, unless the structure qualifies under the Montana Historic Preservation Act. In which case, I'm doing restoration work on a pre-1900 agricultural structure, which is a different legal category entirely." He looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not skepticism exactly. Something more like reassessment. "That's a specific argument," he said. "It's a specific law. You'd need documentation, proof the original structure predates 1900. "I know. I'm working on it." He was quiet for another moment. Then he climbed back up toward the entrance and stood at the edge of the depression in the late afternoon light. "I'm going to recommend this be classified as pending historic assessment rather than active violation," he said. "That gives you 30 days to produce documentation." He looked at me directly. "30 days, Miss Wynne. After that, I have to make a formal determination. I understand. He walked toward his truck, paused with his hand on the door. Diane Keller is not a woman who changes her approach when the first one fails, he said. She finds other angles. Be aware of that. He drove away. I stood in the field for a long time after he left, looking at the mound of earth that covered the stone chamber I had spent weeks rebuilding. From up here, it looked like almost nothing. A slight rise in a field of dry grass. Something you could drive past on the gravel road without ever wondering what was underneath. 30 days. I had 30 days to prove that what I was standing on had been standing since before anyone alive today was born. Ruth Gideon came that same evening. She arrived as the sun was going down, moving carefully across the uneven ground toward where I was sitting on the tailgate of my truck. She carried a loaf of bread wrapped in a dish towel still warm. She sat down on a camp stool I had set near the entrance without being invited to, and looked at the horizon for a moment before speaking. Harlan saw Wade Pruitt's truck come out this way, she said. He filed a complaint with the county. I didn't specify who. I had a feeling she already knew. Ruth nodded slowly. She smoothed the dish towel over her lap. I want to tell you something about my husband, she said. Not to excuse him, just so you understand what you're dealing with. I waited. We had a daughter, she said. Cassidy. She was 16 years old when she died. Car accident, Winter Road outside of Missoula, 1991. She looked at the horizon. The light was going orange at the edges. Cassidy was full of plans, full of ideas about what she was gonna do and who she was gonna be. She had a certainty about her that I used to find both wonderful and a little terrifying. A pause. After she died, Harlan stopped believing in plans, in ideas, in certainty about the future. He looked at young people after that, and all he could see was everything that could be taken away. She turned and looked at me with eyes that held the particular clarity of someone who has lived long enough to understand things that younger people can only observe from the outside. When he looks at you, she said, he sees Cassidy. He sees everything he lost. And so he tells you that you're digging your own grave, because if he lets himself believe you might succeed, he has to let himself hope. And hope is the thing that hurt him worst. The bread was warm in the dish towel between us. Somewhere in the grass, something small moved and was still. I'm not trying to make you feel sorry for him, Ruth said. I'm trying to explain why a man who is not cruel acts cruelly sometimes. She reached out and touched my arm briefly, her fingers light and dry. You're proving him wrong every day, every beam you set, and every wall you reinforce. You're showing him that the things he taught himself to stop believing in are still real. She stood, smoothed her jacket, and picked up her dish towel. He'll come around, she said. Harlan always does. He's just slow. She almost smiled. Stubborn and slow. 30 years of marriage, and I still haven't decided if those are flaws or features. She walked back to her car in the last of the evening light. I sat on the tailgate with the warm loaf of bread and thought about what it costs a person to stop hoping, what it costs to deliberately dismantle your own capacity for expectation. Because expectation is the thing that has hurt you most. I thought about my mother standing at the stove with her back to me and whether she had arrived at her silence the same way through some earlier loss. I had never been told about some wound that had taught her that keeping still was safer than reaching toward things. I didn't forgive anyone that evening, but I understood a little more. Thursday came and Bridger picked me up at 7 in the morning in his truck, which was newer than mine, and had a working heater. And we drove to the county seat and parked outside the records office when it opened at 9. The woman at the front desk looked at us with the resigned patience of someone accustomed to people arriving with unrealistic expectations about how long it would take to find things in an archive that had not been comprehensively indexed since the 1970s. She led us down a staircase to a basement room with fluorescent lights and metal shelving units loaded with cardboard boxes, each one labeled in handwriting that ranged from neat to nearly illegible. "Everything prior to 1950 is in this section," she said, gesturing at roughly 200 boxes. "Prior to 1900 is along the back wall." She looked at us. "Good luck." She went back upstairs. Bridger looked at the back wall. I looked at the back wall. "How many boxes do you think that is?" he said. 60, maybe 70. "And we have until 4 o'clock. "Yes." He picked up the first box and carried it to the folding table in the center of the room. I picked up the second. We worked systematically, moving left to right along the shelving units, going through each box with careful speed. Most of what we found was irrelevant. Tax records, livestock registrations, marriage certificates, land transfer documents for parcels nowhere near 14C. Correspondence between county administrators on subjects that had mattered urgently to someone in 1896 and meant nothing now. We made 2 piles on the table: reviewed and not relevant, reviewed and possibly relevant. The possibly relevant pile stayed small for a long time. By noon, we had gone through 43 boxes. We ate the sandwiches Bridger had brought in the truck, standing over the table, not wanting to lose the momentum of the system we'd established. By 2 o'clock, 58 boxes. By 3:15:67. At 3:40, Bridger lifted the lid of a box labeled Survey Records 1889 to 1896 and began going through it 1 page at a time. I was reviewing the final box in the row when I heard him stop moving. "Mara." Something in his voice made me look up immediately. He was holding a piece of paper by its edges, the careful way you hold something fragile and old. The paper was yellowed, the fold lines deep and soft from decades of compression. He laid it flat on the table and I came around to look at it. It was a survey map, hand-drawn to scale the scale noted in small, neat figures at the bottom right corner. The date in the upper right corner was legible even through the fading of 130 years. June 14th, 1892. The map showed a section of what was now Clearwater County. Property boundaries indicated with thin, precise lines. In the lower left quadrant, a rectangle marked clearly with a surveyor's notation in brown ink. The ink faded to the color of old tea, but still entirely readable. Root cellar, stone construction, Harris property, parcel 14C. I stood and looked at that notation for a long time, long enough that the fluorescent lights above us seemed to hum more loudly than they had before, long enough that I became aware of my own breathing slow and even. Proof. Not circumstantial, not interpretable, not dependent on argument or inference or legal maneuvering. proof. The stone chamber I had been rebuilding the walls. I had reinforced with my own hands. The floor I had poured and leveled the roof. I had framed and waterproofed layer by patient layer. Had been documented by a county surveyor in the summer of 1892. It was a structure of historical record. It predated every building code in Montana by decades. And I had been restoring it with dated photographs and documented materials and a written log going back to the first day. I climbed down into the dark and put my hand against the stone. I reached out and took the paper by its edges the way Bridger had, held it, felt the weight of it, which was almost nothing physically, and an enormous amount of everything else. My hands were steady. The woman at the front desk arranged to have the document photographed and certified, which cost $11 and took 20 minutes. I paid it from the money I kept in the front pocket of my jeans. I walked out of the county records office into the afternoon sun with a certified copy of an 1892 survey map folded carefully inside a manila envelope and held against my chest. Bridger walked beside me. Neither of us said anything until we reached the truck. He unlocked it, got in, looked at me across the bench seat. "You have 30 days, he said. "I have the document I need." "How long to file the heritage classification application?" "I've been working on it for 2 weeks. I have the photographs, the materials, logged, the restoration documentation. I can submit within the week." He started the truck, pulled out of the parking lot onto the main road. The afternoon was clear and cold. The sky the particular deep blue of Montana in October, when the first real cold has moved in from the north, and the light has taken on a specific quality of clarity that doesn't exist in summer. "What does Cellar do when the designation goes through?" he said. "She can challenge it. She'll challenge it. But challenging a certified historic preservation designation is a different fight than challenging an unauthorized construction permit. Different courts, different burden of proof, different timeline." I looked out the window at the fields going by. And it buys time. Time for other things to happen. I didn't say what other things. I was still working on that. That night back at the property, I sat in the main chamber with the stone walls close around me, and the lantern throwing warm light across the notebook in my lap. And I wrote out everything I knew in the sequence. I knew it. Diane Cellar, real estate investor Billings, pattern of acquiring agricultural land through fraudulent appraisals, target parcels above rare earth mineral deposits, method lowball cash offers legal intimidation, manufactured zoning concerns, previous victims the Aldous family, likely others, the Aldous farm, sold at a fraction of value, resold to a Denver mining company, Frank Aldous, his wife, their 3 children out of land that 4 generations of their family had worked. And now parcel 14C, now me. I closed the notebook and set it on the shelf with the others and looked at the stone walls that someone had built in the summer of 1892. And that had stood through everything the world had done since then, through 2 world wars and a depression, and the invention of the automobile and the internet, and 100 years of Montana winters. Still standing. I thought about Diane Cellar somewhere in Billings in a house that cost more than most people in this county would see in a decade, going through her own calculations, working out her next approach. I thought about the 1892 survey map in its manila envelope on the shelf above my notebooks. I thought about the Montana Historic Preservation Act, Section 47. The language, precise and unambiguous and completely on my side. If I could get the designation filed and approved before she found another angle. There was still so much that could go wrong. I knew that. The filing could be delayed. The designation could be challenged on procedural grounds. Diane Keller had lawyers who knew the system better than I did and had used it successfully before. 30 days was not a lot of time, and the process was not designed to move quickly. But I had the document. I had the law. I had the dated photographs and the materials logs in 3 months of documented restoration work that demonstrated clearly and specifically, and in my own handwriting, that this had been my intention from the beginning. I had everything I needed. Then the radio I kept on the shelf for news and weather made a sound that changed the frame of everything. Bridger had brought it down that afternoon, a small battery-powered unit, and left it tuned to the county emergency station. I hadn't been paying attention to it while I worked. It had been on in the background weather updates and local notices in the familiar cadence of rural radio, the kind of programming that exists at a low hum beneath daily life. But now, the voice on the radio had changed register. I heard it clearly in the silence of the underground chamber. Arctic front developing over Alberta, moving southeast at significant speed. Projected arrival: Clearwater County within 72 hours. Snowfall accumulations of 24 to 36 inches possible. Wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. Dangerous wind chill values. Residents should prepare for potential multi-day power outages. Montana Power advises customers to have backup heating sources available. This has the potential to be the most significant winter weather event in the region in over a decade. I turned the volume up. The voice continued in the measured cadence of someone trying to convey urgency without inducing panic. Critical infrastructure concerns, vulnerable populations, emergency shelter information. I turned the volume down. I sat in the chamber and looked at the walls around me. The stone that had been standing since 1892. The roof beams I had installed and rated myself working from the structural engineering books I had borrowed from Mrs. Austin, rated for a snow load well above what any forecast was projecting. The drainage system around the perimeter that I had dug by hand and filled with gravel to prevent freeze-thaw pressure against the walls. The wood stove in the corner with its chimney properly seated in the reinforced sleeve above. The stores I had built up over the past 3 weeks, because something in the November sky had felt like warning. 3 weeks of canned goods and dried food. 80 gallons of water in the containers along the rear wall. Firewood stacked outside the entrance and a smaller supply inside. Extra lantern fuel. The battery radio. I thought about Diane Keller somewhere in Billings in a house with central heating and a generator she had probably already arranged to have filled. I thought about Harlan Gideon in the farmhouse a quarter mile down the road. The farmhouse that had been there since the 1940s. The farmhouse that had old gas pipes and an older furnace. I thought about Ruth, 61 years old, with a heart condition she had mentioned once in passing and never elaborated on. I thought about Frank Aldous and his family, out of their land now, living somewhere in the county, in a house that probably ran on the same grid that was gonna fail in 72 hours. I got up and checked the firewood supply. Then I checked the food stores. Then I went back to the main chamber and sat down and finished working through the heritage classification application by lantern light, writing carefully, making sure every date was correct and every photograph was properly labeled. I wanted it ready to file before the storm arrived. After that, whatever came next, I intended to be exactly where I was. Underground, warm, prepared. The storm didn't arrive all at once. It built itself over 3 days, like something living, something that had been gathering strength far to the north and was now moving south, with the particular patience of forces that don't need to hurry, because they know exactly what they're capable of. Wind came first. It arrived the evening before the snow, screaming down from the Canadian border with a voice that had no human quality in it at all, bending the fence posts along the gravel road sideways, tearing the last dead leaves from the cottonwood trees along the creek bed, finding every gap and crack in every structure in Clearwater County, and pushing through. I heard it from underground, not loudly. That was the thing that still surprised me about being below the surface even after months of living this way. Sound traveled differently down here. The wind that was causing genuine violence above arrived in the main chamber as a low, distant pressure, a kind of presence rather than a noise. The stone walls absorbed it. The earth above absorbed it. What reached me was something muffled and remote, the way a storm sounds when you're hearing it from inside a mountain. I sat by the wood stove with my notebook and finished the heritage classification application by lantern light. The next morning, the snow began. I climbed up through the hatch to check conditions at first light and stood at the entrance for exactly 2 minutes. The sky had gone the color of old pewter flat and total the kind of sky that means business and knows it. The first flakes were already falling, not the soft, exploratory flakes of a normal Montana snowfall, but something denser and more deliberate flakes that arrived with the conviction of a system that had been building momentum for 500 miles. I went back down. I had already filed the heritage classification application. Mrs. Austin had helped me arrange the certified mail 2 days before the storm, driving me into town herself, in her sensible station wagon, waiting while I filled out the forms at the post office counter, watching with the quiet attention of someone who understood what was at stake, without needing it explained. The manila envelope with the 1892 survey map was now in the hands of the Montana State Historic Preservation Office in Helena. It was out of my hands. The storm or no storm, that process was moving. What was in my hands now was simpler and more immediate. Keep the fire going, manage the air, stay warm, wait. By midday on the first day, the snow was coming down at a rate I had never seen in 18 years of Montana winters. Visibility above ground was near zero. I could tell from the sound of the wind, which had graduated from pressure to something closer to a sustained roar, muffled but unmistakable, even through 8 feet of earth and 18 inches of stone. The temperature in the main chamber held at 54 degrees without the stove running. When I lit it for 2 hours in the afternoon, the chamber climbed to 61 and held there long after the fire burned down the stone walls, radiating the absorbed heat slowly back into the air, the way a cast iron pan holds heat long after it leaves the burner. I had been right about the thermal mass. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was a fact I was living inside. The second day, the radio told me what was happening above ground. The power grid had failed across most of the county. Transmission lines down. Ice accumulation on towers had caused cascading failures that Montana Power said could take days to repair, possibly longer, depending on whether the storm continued at its current intensity. Emergency shelters were open at the high school gymnasium in town. Roads were impassable. The sheriff's department was asking people to stay home and not attempt to drive. I listened to the radio and thought about home. Not the house with the faded blue walls. Not the kitchen with the burnt eggs and Roy's boots by the door. The home I meant was 12 feet below where I was sitting. Stone walls and concrete floor, and a wood stove throwing orange light across the chamber. And it was mine in a way that nothing had ever been mine before. I was warm. That simple fact, in the context of what I was hearing on the radio, felt almost indecent. People were cold. Pipes were bursting in houses that had been built to fight the weather. Rather than work with it, houses with furnaces that needed electricity and pipes that ran through uninsulated exterior walls, and roofs that were carrying snow loads they had not been designed to handle. I could hear none of that from where I was sitting. I could hear my own breathing and the faint, settling sound of the earth around me, and the distant, muffled conversation of a wind that could not reach me. On the third day, I carefully cleared a path from the hatch entrance outward through the snow, digging a narrow trench that let me get to the firewood I had stacked under a tarp before the storm. The snow above the reinforced roof had drifted to nearly 3 feet in some places, but the roof structure held without so much as a creak of protest. I had calculated the load rating myself, working from the structural engineering manual Mrs. Austin had helped me locate, and the actual snow load bearing down on those beams was well within what I had built for. I brought extra wood inside and closed the hatch. The fourth day passed quietly. On the fifth day, someone knocked on the door. It wasn't a loud knock, more of a scraping sound stone against stone at the reinforced entrance I had built from reclaimed barn board and fitted into the hatch frame the previous September. I heard it clearly in the silence of the chamber and set down the book I had been reading by lantern light and stood up. I climbed to the entrance and pushed the door open. Harlan Gideon stood on the other side. He was hunched forward inside his coat, a heavy canvas ranch coat that should have been warm enough but clearly wasn't not, after however long he had been standing in the wind and snow getting here. Snow clung to his eyebrows and the stubble on his jaw. His breath came in short, visible puffs. His hands, those thick, calloused hands built from decades of working Montana ground, were pressed flat against his thighs in a way that looked like a man trying to hold himself together through sheer physical effort. But it was his eyes that stopped me. The last time I had looked into Harlan Gideon's eyes, they had carried the flat, practiced disappointment of a man who had decided the world was gonna fail him and had arranged his expectations accordingly. There had been judgment in them, a kind of protective contempt that keeps the world at arm's length. That was gone. What was in his eyes now was something raw and unguarded, the expression of a man who has run out of the energy it takes to maintain the armor and is standing before you with nothing between you and whatever is actually happening inside him. "My furnace died," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. like he had been talking to himself for a while on the walk over and had used most of what he had. Gas line froze solid. We tried space heaters, but the power's been out since Tuesday. I stood in the doorway and looked at him. This was the man who had told me at the auction that the girl bought herself a hole, who had driven past my property week after week and shaken his head, who had told me I was digging my own grave and that they would find me come spring, who had, through complaint or association, or simply by being Diane Keller's inadvertent ally in the narrative that said an 18-year-old girl with $12 had no business claiming a piece of this ground, made my already difficult situation harder in ways both direct and ambient. I looked at him standing in the snow and the wind with his armor finally gone, and I thought about Ruth telling me he was not a bad man, just a frightened one. I thought about the daughter who died at 16 on a winter road outside of Missoula. I thought about what it must have cost him, this specific man with this specific history of pride and pain, to walk across a snow-covered field and knock on the door of the girl he had written off. His jaw tightened. "Ruth," he said. "Her heart. The cold is too much for her. She can't." He stopped, looked down at his boots for a moment, looked back at me. "I didn't know where else." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I stepped to one side. "Come in," I said. "Then go back and get your wife." He stood frozen in the doorway for a moment, like a man who had braced for something that didn't come and couldn't quite recalibrate. Then he moved forward and stepped through the stone archway and into the warm glow of the lantern light, and I pulled the door closed behind him against the wind. He stopped just inside the entrance. The main chamber opened before him. Stone walls reinforced with lumber and faced with plywood panels that created smooth interior surfaces. The wood stove in this corner radiating steady heat. The shelves along one wall stocked with canned goods and water containers and the materials of a life that had been built here slowly and deliberately over months. The sleeping area in the rear made up neatly with the blankets Ruth herself had brought me in September, washed and mended before she handed them over. He turned in a slow circle, taking it in. His face did something complicated. Several things in sequence, none of them quite completing before the next one arrived. Then he looked at me. "You built this," he said. Not a question, just a fact he was allowing himself to acknowledge. "Yes." He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter, like something in the register of it had shifted downward. "I'll get Ruth," he said. He turned and went back out into the storm. I spent the 20 minutes he was gone preparing. I moved supplies to make more floor space. I checked the firewood. I filled the largest pot I had with water from the containers and set it on the stove to heat. I arranged the camp cot I had in the storage room and brought it into the main chamber where the heat was better positioned. It near the stove and layered it with every spare blanket I had. When Harlan came back, he was carrying Ruth. Not dramatically. She could walk. But he had his arm around her and was taking her weight. And she was bundled in so many layers, she looked twice her normal size. A cocoon of wool and down with her silver hair just visible above the collar of her outermost coat. Her face was pale and her lips had a faint bluish quality that I did not like. I got her to the cot. I poured the heated water into 2 mugs and made tea weak and very warm and brought it to her with both hands. She took it and held it against her chest and looked around the chamber with an expression that held genuine wonder. "It's warm," she said, like she had forgotten warmth was something that could exist in the world. 55 degrees without the stove. When I run it, it climbs to 62 and holds. I tucked an additional blanket around her legs. The earth acts as insulation. The stone walls absorb and hold heat. It's more stable down here than any house built above the surface. She reached out and took my hand. Her fingers were still cold thin and papery, but her grip was steadier than I expected, given how she looked when she came in. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for not turning us away." "You brought me a casserole when I had nothing," I said, "and bread, and a blanket you'd already washed and mended." She almost smiled. "The blanket needed mending anyway." Harlan sat on a wooden crate near the wall and said nothing. He held his mug of tea in both hands and looked at the stone walls and the stove and the life that existed down here, below the surface of a field he had driven past for months, while shaking his head at the foolishness of the girl who had bought the hole. Word traveled the way it does in a county where everyone knows everyone and the normal channels of information, phones and internet, and the idle traffic of people moving through town had been partly interrupted by the storm, but not entirely. People still talked. People still moved when they had to. And the fact that Harlan Gideon's truck was parked at the property of the girl who had bought the Harris Cellar during the worst storm in a decade was the kind of thing that gets noticed and discussed and passed along. By the second day after the Gideons arrived, the Aldous family came. Frank Aldous, his wife Marlene, and their 3 children. The youngest was 5 years old, a girl named Petra, and when they came through the door, her lips were the color of the sky before dawn. I got her next to the stove before I did anything else. Frank stood in the center of the chamber and looked around. The way everyone looked around. The first time that slow turning circle of reassessment. "We heard there was a place," he said. His voice was rough, abraded by cold and days of stress. "Heard a girl built something that actually worked." He looked at me. Something in his face that I recognized not from knowing him, but from knowing what it felt like to have the ground taken out from under you and be trying to stand anyway. "Come in," I said. "All of you." The Aldous children fell asleep on the floor near the stove, within 20 minutes their small bodies finally releasing the tension they had been carrying for days. Petra slept with her head on her father's rolled jacket, and her color came back slowly pink, returning to her lips and cheeks as the warmth reached her. Frank watched her sleep, and I watched Frank, and neither of us said anything for a while. Eventually, he turned to me. "I know who you are," he said quietly, so as not to wake the children. "You're the one Keller was trying to buy out. The one who said no." "Yes." He looked at the chamber walls, the stone that had been here since before anyone living was born, the roof I had rebuilt beam by beam, the floor I had poured level in the summer heat. "She told us our land was worthless," he said. "Told us we'd been fighting a losing battle for years. She had paperwork, appraisals from people I'd never heard of. environmental assessments. It all looked real. He paused. We believed her. We needed to believe her, I think. It was easier to believe the land was the problem instead of believing someone was lying to us. Marlene reached over and put her hand on his arm without speaking. 6 months later, he said, we found out what the land actually was, what it was actually worth. I'm sorry, I said. He shook his head. Don't apologize. You didn't do it. He looked at me directly. You're the one who stopped her. The one who said no when the rest of us didn't know enough to say it. He extended his hand across the space between us. I shook it. 2 more families came the following day, neighbors of the Alduses who had heard through the chain of communication that had assembled itself out of necessity and community, and the old human instinct to find warmth and tell others where you found it. I managed the space, carefully rotating people through in shifts. When the chamber reached capacity, keeping the ventilation working properly, monitoring the air quality. The way Bridger had helped me understand, I needed to intake low exhaust, high natural draft through the 2 PVC pipes that rose from the chamber to the surface. Bridger himself had arrived on the 2nd day of the storm on cross-country skis, appearing at the entrance with a backpack full of supplies he had salvaged from the building supply store before the roads became impassable. Extra lantern fuel, candles, a case of soup. He had skied 3 miles through the beginning of the storm to get here, which he reported in the same matter-of-fact tone he used for everything. And he set down the backpack and started helping without being asked. He took over the logistics of managing the rotating families so I could focus on the maintenance of the systems that kept everyone warm. He was good at it in the quiet, competent way. He was good at most things, organizing without overreaching, communicating clearly. Staying calm in the way that calm people make everything around them slightly calmer. At night, when the visitors had gone back to their cold houses for a few hours of uncomfortable sleep, or were settled in whatever corner of the chamber they had been assigned, Bridger and I would sit by the stove and talk. Not about anything urgent. About the things people talk about when they have been through something together, and the immediate crisis has reached a temporary plateau of manageability, and there is a moment to simply be 2 people in a warm place while the storm continues its business above. He told me about his uncle's store and how he had ended up there, a practical decision made at 17 when college hadn't been financially realistic and the store had needed someone reliable. He told me about his grandfather's land in the Bitterroot Valley, sold before Bridger was born, and how his family had never quite recovered from the loss of it. Not financially, but in some deeper way that didn't have a clean name. I told him about the library on Elm Street, about the afternoons I had spent in the stacks reading about things I had no immediate use for, building a structure of knowledge out of curiosity and necessity, and the simple need to be somewhere that felt safe. That's why you knew what to do, he said. I knew what to read, I said. That's different. He smiled. Not that different. On the 8th day of the storm, which was also the 12th day since it had begun building, I heard the sound of an engine approaching that was different from the wind and different from the occasional creak of the earth above me. Not a car engine. Something smaller, higher pitched. A snowmobile. I climbed up to the entrance. Sheriff Wade Pruitt was dismounting from the snowmobile 20 feet away, his face red from the wind, his coat crusted with ice along the collar. He walked toward the entrance with the deliberate step of a man who had been working without proper rest for many days and had made peace with that fact. He looked at the cleared path to the entrance, the ventilation pipes breathing steam into the frigid air. The stone archway swept clean. "I heard what you've been doing out here," he said. His voice was rough with fatigue. People needed a warm place. He looked past me into the glow of the chamber below. "Mind if I come down?" I stepped aside. He descended carefully and stood in the main chamber and did the slow turning circle that everyone did. But his version of it was different. Professional. Systematic. The eyes of a man who spent his working life assessing situations. "I've had 3 structure collapses this week," he said. 2 barn roofs, 1 residential, 14 burst pipe calls. 2 elderly residents found unresponsive in their homes when their heat failed. He looked at the ceiling at the reinforced beams. "You're safer here than most of what's above ground in this county." "The earth doesn't fight the load," I said. "It accepts it. The beams transfer the weight into the walls. The walls transfer it into the ground. The structure is designed to work with gravity, not against it." He looked at me with the reassessment expression he had shown the first time he came out here, that particular recalibration of a man who had updated his expectations. "I have news," he said. He reached inside his coat and produced a folded document. Official letterhead. State seals. He held it out. I took it. "We executed a search warrant on Diane Keller's office in Billings 4 days ago," he said. "Before the storm made travel impossible. What we found in there goes well beyond what she tried to do to you." I unfolded the document. My hands were steady. I read. The words were the dry, precise language of law enforcement stripped of drama, but full of weight. Forged property appraisals. Falsified environmental assessments. Documented intimidation of elderly landowners in at least 4 counties. 6 properties acquired through fraudulent representation over a 5-year period. The Aldous farm specifically named. 3 other families named after that. And parcel 14C Clearwater County, attempted acquisition by misrepresentation. "She was arrested 2 days ago in Billings," Pruitt said. 12 counts of real estate fraud. 3 counts of financial elder abuse. 1 count of attempted theft by deception. I kept looking at the document. "The minerals survey under your parcel," he said. "Preliminary assessment puts the rare earth deposit value at approximately $2 million. He paused to let that number exist in the air between us. "She was going to pay you $750. I thought about Diane Keller and the silver car, the practiced smile, the nails, the color of dried blood. The absolute confidence of a woman who had done this before and expected to do it again. I thought about Frank Aldous' face when he talked about the appraisals that looked real. I thought about Mrs. Austin sliding a geological survey abstract across the library table. "And the heritage designation," I said. Pruitt almost smiled. "Just the beginning of it. The State Preservation Office received your application before the storm. Given the quality of the documentation, the 1892 survey map, the restoration log, they're fast-tracking the review." He folded his hands. "I've spoken with the county assessor. It is my recommendation that parcel 14C be officially designated a historic agricultural site. Once that designation is confirmed, the mineral rights protection provision is automatic. He looked at me. No one is going to touch this land. When I folded the document carefully along its original lines and held it against my side, outside somewhere above 8 feet of earth and 18 inches of stone and 2 feet of compacted snow, the wind continued its business. It didn't know or care about search warrants and heritage designations, and the particular arithmetic of $12 versus $2 million. It was just weather doing what weather does, indifferent and total. Down here, the stove burned steadily. The walls held. "She underestimated you," Pruitt said. "Everyone did." He nodded, looked at the chamber one final time. "When this is over, Miss Wynne, I think you should consider sharing what you know about building this way, about working with the land." He moved toward the entrance. "People around here could learn something." He climbed back up into the storm without waiting for an answer. I stood in the center of the chamber for a while after he left alone for the first time in days, and let the quiet settle around me. The lantern threw its orange light across the stone walls. The stove ticked quietly as the metal expanded with the heat. From somewhere above, muffled by earth and distance, I could still hear the wind. I thought about Diane Keller and found that I felt almost nothing toward her. Not triumph, not satisfaction, not the particular pleasure of having been proven right. She had tried to take what was mine, and she had failed, and now the law was handling her with the thoroughness it occasionally, when things worked the way they were supposed to, applied to people who operated the way she had. That was enough. I didn't need to feel anything additional about it. What I felt was something quieter and more personal. I felt settled. 3 days later, on a morning that arrived with less wind than any morning in nearly 2 weeks, Harlan Gideon found me alone in the storage room organizing the supply shelves. He came through the doorway and stopped the way he had stopped at the entrance on the first night, taking a moment before committing to whatever he had come here to do. I set down the can I was holding and waited. He stood in the doorway with his hands clasped in front of him, his thick, calloused fingers interlaced, and he looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked at me. "I was wrong," he said. His voice had the quality of something being said with considerable effort, each word chosen, and then released with the deliberateness of a man who does not speak this way often, and finds it costs him something to do so. "About you," he continued, "about this place, about what I thought when I saw you at the auction, and what I said when I drove by, and what I told myself about why you were going to fail." He looked at the stone walls. "About all of it." I didn't say anything. I had learned that some moments require silence, not because there is nothing to say, but because the person speaking needs the space to finish what they came to say without being interrupted. "My daughter," he said. His voice dropped to something closer to rough. "Cassidy. She would have been 33 years old this past October. She died in the winter of '91. Icy road. She was coming home from a friend's house, and the car went off the road, and that was..." He stopped, cleared his throat. "That was that." He looked at me, and his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lantern light. After we lost her, I told myself that hope was what hurt people, that expecting things to work out was just setting yourself up to have them taken away. I looked at young people and I saw everything that could go wrong, everything that could be lost. He paused. I looked at you and I saw a girl about to make a terrible mistake, and I decided it was easier to tell you so than to watch. The storage room was quiet. The stove in the main chamber made its small sounds. Outside, the diminished wind moved through the surface world at a register that barely reached us. But you weren't making a mistake, he said. You were building something. You could see what it could be when the rest of us could only see what it was. And I was too. He stopped again, swallowed. I was too afraid of hoping that you might be right to let myself consider it. He looked at me with the eyes of a man who had laid down something heavy and wasn't yet sure what it felt like to stand without it. What you did here, he said. What you did for Ruth. What you did for those families. You didn't have to do any of that. You had every reason to tell us all to find somewhere else. His voice had gone very quiet. But you didn't. I looked at him for a moment, at the weathered face and the patched overalls and the hands that had worked Montana ground for 40 years and had never quite learned how to hold the things that mattered most without gripping too hard. I didn't build this place to keep it to myself, I said. I built it because I needed solid ground. He was quiet. I'm not angry with you, I said. I understand why you said what you said. Ruth explained some of it, and I understood the rest. I looked at the stone walls around us. But I want you to know that it wouldn't have changed anything. What you said at the auction, what you said when you drove by. I was going to build this place regardless, because I didn't have anywhere else to go, and because I could see what it was even then. He nodded slowly. I know, he said. That's part of what I'm trying to say. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly. The gesture of a man who does not give physical comfort easily, but is trying. You showed me that I was wrong about something I thought I understood. That takes more than stubbornness. He looked at me directly. That takes the kind of person Cassidy would have been. He turned and walked back to the main chamber, back to Ruth, back to the warmth. I stood in the storage room for a while after he left, looking at the stone walls that someone had built in the summer of 1892. And I thought about all the people those walls had outlasted, and all the weather they had absorbed, and all the weight they had agreed to carry. Then I got back to work. The power came back on the 17th day early in the morning. I knew about it only because Bridger went above ground to check on surface conditions and came back down with a look on his face that was different from his usual expression. Lighter, the specific lightness of someone delivering good news who isn't quite sure how it will land. Lights are coming on in town, he said. I looked around the chamber, the lantern, the stove, the stone walls. Good, I said. People can go home. He looked at me. What about you? I looked at the main chamber, at the work still to be done, the smaller things I had deferred during the weeks of managing the crisis. The ventilation upgrade I had been planning, the second sleeping space. I wanted to properly finish the garden terracing on the south-facing slope I had sketched out in my notebook during the long, quiet nights. "I am home," I said. They came over the following days as the roads were plowed, and the world returned to something resembling its normal patterns. One by one, and sometimes in pairs, the families who had used the underground chamber as a warming station during the worst of the storm. They came to say thank you, which they did in the practical, understated way of people who are not accustomed to being in someone's debt and find the position uncomfortable. Frank Aldous came on the third day after the storm ended. He brought firewood, a full cord of it split, and stacked with the neatness of a man who had been working wood his whole life. He didn't make a speech about it. He just stacked it, and then stood and looked at the mound of earth above the chamber entrance in the thin winter sunlight. "My grandfather built his first house out of sod," he said. 1893. First winter in Montana. He looked at me. He used to say the land doesn't fight you if you know how to ask it right. He picked up his gloves from the stack. "I think you figured out how to ask." He drove away. The days that followed had a quality of ordinary life that felt, after everything, almost startling. The filing of the heritage designation moved through the State Preservation Office with the speed that Pruitt had indicated it would, and the official designation arrived by certified mail on a Tuesday morning in late November. A document with the state of Montana seal in the corner, and language that left no ambiguity about what it meant for Parcel 14C. Permanent Historic Designation. Agricultural structure of documented pre-1900 origin. Protected from development modification or subsurface extraction activities. I put it in the same binder as the 1892 survey map. Bridger helped me build a proper entry shelter over the hatch that winter. A small above-ground structure that kept the snow from accumulating directly over the entrance and gave anyone coming or going a brief transitional space between the surface world and the underground one. It wasn't large or elaborate. Reclaimed lumber, a simple pitched roof, a door with a proper latch, functional. Solid. We worked on it over 3 weekends in December when the weather allowed. On a morning in late April, I climbed up through the entry shelter into a world that had reorganized itself while I wasn't paying full attention. The snow was gone from all but the shadowed northern slopes. The cottonwood trees along the creek had put out their first tentative leaves, that particular yellow-green that exists only in the first 2 weeks of spring, before the color deepens and settles into summer. The sky was the blue my father had put on a bedroom wall when I was 8 years old, and I stood in it for a moment with my eyes closed, feeling the sun on my face. Bridger came up behind me with 2 cups of coffee. We stood side by side and looked out at the land in the early light. The south-facing slope where Ruth had helped me lay out the garden beds in March. The soil turned and waiting the first seeds already in the ground under a light covering of straw. The stack of materials at the edge of the property for the next phase of the project, which I'd been planning through the winter in my notebooks, an extension of the storage room further into the hillside. A proper workshop space with room for the tools I had accumulated. "What are you thinking about?" Bridger asked. "Holes," I said. He looked at me. "The kind people see, and the kind that are actually there," I said. "Everyone who stood at the edge of this property and looked down saw a hole. Something worthless. Something to laugh at." I looked at the entry shelter he had helped me build, at the ventilation pipes breathing their steady exhalations into the spring air. But that's not what it was. What was it? I looked at the land, at the south-facing garden slope and the gravel path Harlan had helped me lay in February, coming over on a cold Saturday without being asked and working beside me for 6 hours without saying much beyond what was necessary about the work itself. At the modest above-ground marker I had placed near the entry, a flat stone with the parcel number, and the designation date carved into it, not a monument, just a record. A foundation, I said. I just had to dig down far enough to find it. Bridger drank his coffee. He was quiet in the particular way he was always quiet, not uncomfortable, not waiting for something, just present. Or build it, he said. I thought about that. Or build it, I agreed. From down the gravel road came the sound of a truck familiar by now, the specific rattle of Harlan Gideon's pickup with its slightly loose tailgate. He pulled up and parked and got out with a basket in one hand, Ruth beside him, moving more carefully than she had in the fall, the winter having taken something from her that spring was only beginning to restore. "Morning," Harlan called. "Morning," I said. Ruth was carrying something covered with a dish towel that smelled even from where I was standing like fresh biscuits. She came toward the entry shelter and then stopped and looked at it, at the simple pitched roof and the solid door and the path of flat stones leading to it, and something moved across her face. "You've been busy," she said. "Always," I said. She handed me the covered dish. The biscuits were warm through the cloth. She looked at me with the eyes of a woman who had seen both the worst and the best of what people were capable of, and had made her peace with the proportion of each. "There's enough for 4, she said. "Harlan ate already, but he'll eat again if you let him." Harlan from behind her made a sound that was approximately a protest and approximately a confirmation. I looked at the 4 of us standing in the spring morning, 2 cups of coffee, a basket of eggs, a covered dish of biscuits. The entry shelter Bridger had helped me build, the garden Ruth had helped me plan, the gravel path Harlan had helped me lay on a cold February Saturday, the land that $12 and a deed on thin paper had made mine. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I pulled it out. The screen showed 3 words. Mom calling. I stood in the spring light with the phone in my hand and looked at those 2 words for a moment. 3 months since the storm. Longer since the morning in the kitchen with the burnt eggs and the boots on the hook and the silence that was louder than anything Roy had said. I answered. The silence on the other end lasted 2 seconds. 3, the specific silence of someone who has rehearsed this moment many times and found that none of the rehearsals quite prepared them for the actual thing. "Are you okay?" my mother said. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. The same register, the same slight catch at the end of a sentence that had always been there. That small hesitation before finishing a thought, as if she was always slightly unsure whether she had the right to complete it. 3 words. After all of it, "Are you okay?" Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I should have said something." Not, "I watched you walk away and put my hand against the glass and wished I had the kind of courage that could reach through a window." Not any of the things I had imagined her saying in the quiet underground nights of that long winter. Just 3 words. "Are you okay?" I looked out at the spring morning, at the land that was mine, legally, permanently, undeniably mine. at the garden waiting for warmth, at the people standing in the early light who had become, without formal declaration or ceremony, simply the people who came to this place. "I'm okay, Mom," I said. "I have a home." The silence on the other end again, shorter this time. "Good," she said, barely audible. The word carried more weight than its single syllable suggested. "Good," I said. I ended the call and put the phone back in my pocket. I didn't feel the way I had thought I would feel in the months when I had imagined this call in the abstract, lying in the sleeping area of the underground chamber, with the stone walls close and the lantern burned low. I had imagined something larger, some resolution with clean edges, some feeling that arrived fully formed and named itself clearly. What I felt instead was quieter than that. Something that had no exact name but felt like the specific kind of peace that comes not from having answered a question, but from having decided that you can carry it forward without it breaking anything essential. She had called. She had asked. I had answered. The rest could wait. Roy had told me that morning in the kitchen that I would figure it out. He had meant it dismissively, the way you say something to someone you're trying to move past, the way you dismiss a problem by gesturing toward its eventual resolution without caring what form that resolution takes. He was right that I would figure it out. He was wrong about nearly everything else. I had not figured out how to find the life I needed. I had figured out how to build it. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. Finding implied that the thing you needed already existed somewhere in the world and required only location and luck. Building implied something else entirely, something that required your hands and your time, and your willingness to stay with the work on the days when the work was hard and the progress was invisible, and the people driving past shook their heads at what they saw. Building implied that the thing you needed might not exist yet, that you might be the one who had to make it. Harlan was watching me from across the path. He had an expression I had never seen on him before. The storm. Something open and uncomplicated, the face of a man who had set down the heaviest thing he was carrying and found the world lighter without it. "Biscuits are getting cold," he said. Ruth touched his arm. I put my phone in my pocket and walked toward them across the flat stone path in the April morning toward the coffee, and the biscuits and the warmth of the chamber below and the garden above, and the $12 worth of solid ground I had spent a year learning to stand on. I did not look back. This time it wasn't because I was afraid of what I might see. This time there was simply nothing behind me worth looking back for. Everything I had was here. Everything I needed I had built.